Hi, everybody. This is Warren Herman. Today we're going to speak about a very important principle for dealing with our minds. One of the big problems with dealing with our minds is that whenever we don't want a certain kind of thought, we flinch at it. This leads to the problem of amplification. So, if we don't want to have an angry thought, an impure thought, whatever it is, we flinch when it arises. And because we flinch, the brain that thinks it's important, and the brain, if let's say I don't want to judge people, then every time I have a thought of judgment, I flinch. I try to see, am I not going to have a thought of judgment? Then I become compulsive. And then we end up in a thing where you're trying to resist this thought. And as Carl Jung once said, what you resist persists. It's very similar to a squeezy ball. If you've ever seen a squeezy ball, like a stress ball, when you're not putting pressure on the ball, you don't see all the little bubbly things inside. But when you put the pressure on it, you see the bubbly things. And when you're trying not to think about something, it amplifies whatever you're trying to think about. So here's the thing. How do we handle things that are in our minds? One of the principles that's very disturbing with regard to this is an instruction that's given for dealing with temptations. For example, there are certain temptations that it's said we can deal with directly. And I believe this is from Dom Scopoli in his, I think it's Spiritual Combat. And I'm going to give a slightly different idea. And, you could run it past a priest, but I think that this idea only stands on its own merits. This is kind of an uncharted territory, but I think that, we could apply some principles. If you're scrupulous, you might apply the thing that since there's only an uncertain obligation to apply a specific understanding of indirect resistance, you could probably use this method. I know that sounds like a tongue twister, but if you're scrupulous and you have read the teachings on indirect resistance of impurity, you might benefit from using that distinction in order to use this technique that I'm going to share today with more mental freedom. Because here's the thing. I don't believe that there is a clear understanding of what direct and indirect resistance methods are. For those who are unfamiliar, it is often taught that one can directly resist a good number of types of temptations. For example, one can directly resist pride, meaning one can call to mind prideful situations. One can, directly debate with prideful thoughts. But it is recommended to indirectly resist temptations toward impurity. This is because, because they talk about, this is just a more dangerous type of temptation to do direct resistance on. It's better to move your mind away from the temptation. However, one of the critical problems with this method of resistance is that it often creates a phobia of these thoughts in the mind and creates vast amounts of disturbance for those who use this method. So the more one tries to resist these thoughts, the more disturbing they become, because if one needs to move one's mind away from such a thought because it is dangerous, then the amount of fear is infused into the personality, and one experiences a great terror of these kinds of thoughts and a great disturbance at their arising. And so it eventually can take on the problem where people can start to flinch at seeing the faces of other people. People can start to flinch at their own thoughts, and it can be very disturbing and distressing. And then because of the fear itself can amplify these thoughts and cause these thoughts to seem to be arising more strongly in the mind, because one is trying not to think them, or one is so afraid of thinking them that they are put into consciousness itself. They're brought up into consciousness by that resistance. And so it is best if we could simply move our minds away from these thoughts, it is best. But if we do that, we'd have to do so without any fear. But I think there's a possibility that there is another kind of indirect resistance which may be more effective. This strategy is what is spoken about in things like acceptance and commitment therapy as thought diffusion. Thought diffusion is caused whenever we are in an observing state of mind toward our thoughts. It happens whenever we can kind of witness our thoughts. And this is a method that is often trained in the mindfulness approaches of Buddhism and in secular therapies of a related type. I've made many other videos about the dangers of mindfulness and the potential of mindfulness as a redeemed discipline. And so I'm not going to go into that here, but suffice it to say that I think that there is a way of doing indirect resistance on these types of thoughts. And so if we have a temptation toward impurity, what we might be able to do, and I believe that we have enough, there's enough uncertainty about whether this is direct that we can proceed as if it is truly, we're not under an obligation not to use this approach, because we could look at the way we're working with the mind in this situation and say, okay, that actually looks kind of indirect. So we have freedom, I believe, to try to use this. So if we have, the thought arise, this impure thought or impure glance or something like that, what we could do is we can simply observe what's happening inside us as it's all arising. We could observe the experience inside of us as a whole. And that creates a buffer between us and the experience, which is different than consent. That allows us to be aware of the situation, in touch with the situation, not fleeing from the situation, not flinching, but conscious and accepting of the movement as it's coming in. And so it's almost as if, if something were to fall in my hand is not consenting to it. I'm not digging my fingers into it. My hand is not consenting to it, but the object has fallen in my hand. That's what awareness is like in this situation. So it is an observing stance, just watching the mind. Now, needless to say, this is not something that's a normal or a usual cognitive skill. It would probably need to be trained. You'd have to have some experience being able to focus on certain objects. Because if you focus on an object, you then can notice how your mind is trying to pull you away from that object by distracting you with other things. Then you can, I'm looking at my thoughts. That's what I'm talking about, being able to look at the thought and see it. And as we develop this ability, that's one way we can do this. We could also do this by labeling the thought. This is not yet not a fully prayerful technique yet, but we're going to see how that could happen in a second. You could say, that's just thoughts, just fears. You can just say to yourself, fears, as you're noticing the thought, fears. That could help anchor, not only in awareness, anchor it in, anchoring it in attention. So if you're just holding it with your hand with attention, just holding the temptation with attention. So it's just this is very similar to what St. Francis of Sales says. He says, don't move. If the temptation arises, don't move. It's like bees that have landed on you. Just don't move and they'll fly away. This is I think this is a very in-depth description of this method. And so it's allowing the bees to land on us, noticing their buzzing, noticing what they're doing, being aware and peaceful toward the bees and non-reactive. And that is what we could do just with awareness. But I think it could also help if we use a thought to help anchor us in awareness, saying, okay, thinking, or you could just say, I'm here, God is here. You could just say a thought. But you could also do a prayer. So you could say something like, Lord, look at this. Lord, look at this. You could outsource the awareness to God in a way. Or you could say, be with me here, be with me in this. Just allowing, it's almost like you and Jesus are sitting at a window and your awareness is the temptation comes to the window like a salesman, and you're sitting at the table with Jesus and you're watching the thing come up to the window. And because you're inside with Jesus, inside the aware posture with Jesus, inside the house of your inner room with Jesus, and you are the salesman comes to the door and you just watch him through the glass and you say, Jesus, can you handle this? Jesus, be with me in this. You just talk to him so that you maintain this aware and accepting posture. Say, be with me. Help, be with this, Jesus. Be with this as you watch dispassionately and awarely the thoughts that arise in the mind. And I believe this is a cure for scrupulosity. You look at it, you just observe the thought as awareness with Jesus. Prayerfulness. Not only mindfulness, not only thoughtfulness, prayerfulness. It's almost like the first with awareness, it's like we're holding the thought with our hand. The second, the thoughtfulness, is like holding the thought with like a food services glove. The third is like holding the thought with a medical glove. And I believe that's probably the best way to hold the thoughts in prayerfulness. It's probably the healthiest way. But I think the other ones also count as indirect resistances to temptation, but have the extremely important effect of not leading to an increased phobia, not leading, I'm flinching, I'm moving away from that thought. That leads to an amplification of and greater significance of that thought in our lives. The way to calm things down, I believe, is through this prayerfulness, this watchful, prayerful attitude toward our thoughts. As it says in the book, Confronting and Controlling Thoughts According to the Philokalia, by, I believe, it's Father Coniaris. It's an Orthodox work, but I think it has some important points in it. He says, to survey the thoughts is to calm them. And that's what we're trying to do here. But he says, prayer purifies watchfulness, watchfulness purifies prayer. And I think it's very important to have that prayerful, watchful approach to our thoughts so that we can accept them and not flinch at them, so that they quiet down on their own and we live in peace.